Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast that will always stick together, come thick or thin.
I just wanted to say, Tom, that I'm forming my own independent podcast.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, just separate of this. There's been too much bullying within this podcast here, so we're going to have to go our separate ways. Apparently, I'm more popular than the Lib Dems already, so that's a good start.
So, besides deciding to go off into your own independent podcast, what's your week been like, Rob?
Yeah, it's been very good. I mean, I say very good. This is just minor gripes now, but my car went wrong, and then I fixed it, and I was like, yay! And then literally the day after my car got fixed, I got a chip in my windscreen, and I just thought like, oh god, the world doesn't want me to have a functioning car. But apart from that, I'm absolutely fine. How are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I mean, I've had a weirdly long string of weekends in a row where I haven't actually had much to do, which has been nice. I've mostly been catching up on all the Eurovision semi-finals, like in their individual countries, which is making me feel very European. Which means I might be shockingly disappointed come the 29th of March. It's been good. I've been catching up with Denmark and Sweden's Melodifesten, which I think is how you pronounce it. I'm not good at Swedish. That's been good.
That's a level of Eurovision commitment that I've never done before. I like my Eurovision. I listen to the playlist on Spotify before it all goes up. But doing that, watching the qualifiers for each individual country, hats off to you.
I mean, it's not something I would have done if it weren't for the fact that I'm on a Discord server where there's a group of Eurovision fans who basically organise all of this, say, we're going to watch it at this time of day, and here's a link to their equivalent of iPlayer for each country, which mostly works, which is pretty cool. And, you might be a few seconds out of sync, but you generally know you're watching the same songs and stuff, which is pretty cool.
The caliber of song that makes it to the final, there's some pretty weird and wonderful things there. Does it get weirder the further back in the process you go?
I mean, there's definitely. I mean, I don't know if you've seen our final, which is clearly it's nowhere near as big over here. And this year we had some weird voting system, and we ended up getting the person none of us really wanted. But there were definitely people who were a bit out of tune and stuff like that in the British one, and we only had 6 finalists. And then you look at these other shows where they have 4 semi-finals with 5 different finalists at each semi-final. Then there's some weird stuff in there. But I mean, it's interesting to watch it get culled, as you'd expect. It's also annoying and frustrating when you have to write off an entire country for their poor choice of a finalist. Well, without further ado, let's head on into Headline Quickfire. So, as we've been doing the last few weeks, going to start off with some positive news. Again, we all like a good pun in a headline. This week's one is, the best thing since sliced bread, UK bread bag recycling scheme launched. And I suppose it's one of those things you might not think about very often, but bread comes in a plastic bag. Most people just throw that away. If you get maybe slightly fancier bread, it comes in paper and people know to recycle that. But I'd hate to think how much plastic is just thrown away on that kind of plastic bag. So yeah, seems like a decent idea to me.
Yeah, seems like a really good idea. We talked, I think, in the past about lots of supermarkets trying to get rid of plastic packaging, and it's something that, like you say, you don't really think about until you go, oh goodness, don't we waste a lot of packaging that way? Didn't we run a story a couple of episodes ago about a supermarket that had gone entirely plastic free, or at least in a section?
I think we did mention that, or it's definitely been in the news. So there is definitely something like that going around.
Yeah, it's nice to see things change, going in that direction.
Yeah, I think, people complain about a lot of things, and maybe it gets hyped up too much in the media when these efforts are going forwards. But in general, recycling things and not making as much waste is a good idea for the planet. There's only a finite amount of resources. Until we start, having replicators that run purely on solar power anyway. So, it's a good idea. So our next headline, Daily Mail stripped of her passport. And again, alluding back to something from last week, this was actually I try and mix up who we get the headlines from in this section. And I felt like the Daily Mail could have been much more angry about this than they were. I mean, they were getting their way, clearly. So maybe that's why.
This is the story of Shamia Begum, the IS bride who was looking for essentially her citizenship to come back to Britain in order for her to have the birth of her first child back in England. That has now been revoked by the Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, and it has been the source of much debate. I think it's one of those few news stories that seems to have touched almost everybody I've known has had something to say about it, one way or the other. You heard did you hear Shamina's interview from her herself? Did you read any of that?
I watched a clip. I don't know how edited it was because it was only about 2 minutes long, with her being obviously interviewed by by a reporter. And the main criticism I saw of that was she didn't seem to show any remorse in that particular interview. I can see that being an argument, but I think my main concern is that the precedence of the Foreign Secretary just being able to strip someone of their citizenship is a worrying precedent. And I mean, I think if it started happening all the time, people would probably be more up in arms about it. This is a specific set of circumstances that meant he was able to use that power with a lot of people being like, yeah, okay. But that's the bit I don't like about this. I don't think if she's done something wrong, she should come back and have a trial in the UK under our system, would be my rule, because she was until she was stripped of it a British citizen. I know it's technically possible to lose your citizenship for various things, but it always feels like that is walking a particular line if you revoke citizenship.
Yeah, precisely. I think it sets a dangerous precedent. I think I might feel more comfortable with it if the Home Secretary said that anybody who went to America and joined the KKK or some sort of similarly extreme organisation could also be banned. But my fear is that this is ISIS. This is a young woman who's being targeted. It sort of hits a cultural spot for the UK where it seems like the easiest decision for people to make is to ban her. Does that make sense? It's sort of touching on a lot of things where a lot of people's knee-jerk reaction is, no, she shouldn't come back. But I think when you get to think about it deeper and think about the other sort of wider consequences it has, I personally believe that she should be allowed back, or at least her. I mean, she's now given birth to a child who didn't decide to come into the world in a Syrian refugee camp. A child that should have some form of British citizenship. The UK government has allowed it to be born out there, which to me seems a little irresponsible. It's one of those stories where everyone has an opinion, and I agree with your interpretation of her interview that, at least she didn't seem to show any remorse. I don't think she helped herself in any way, shape or form to be able to be brought back into the country. But I do fear about what consequences it may have further down the line for other people looking to return to the UK in similar circumstances.
So our next headline is from the Financial Times. Trump's softer rhetoric on Huawei raises hopes of China trade accord.
They're the Chinese telecoms mobile phone manufacturer who have been in the news recently, I think, for fear of Chinese spying.
I mean, I have a Huawei watch. They must be tracking my every move. Yeah. I've definitely it very rarely kind of comes under our purview, this kind of stuff, but on the tech podcasts I listen to, it has been a big story for a while. People were concerned, and I think you can see when you connect your watch and everything, you have the option to be like, oh, I don't want Huawei Health, I don't want this, I don't want all of that. So I think at least for the watches, it's fine. If you're looking at a mobile phone, maybe people have more concerns there about what's being tracked on them. But I think at the moment there's a lot of bluster and not necessarily any hard facts on it.
Yes, there's certainly a bit of fear or scaremongering around them in general, and the fact that Trump is being softer towards them, or at least friendlier towards them, suggests that maybe the US-China trade war that's been going on may be coming to an end. I know that China's certainly been feeling the pinch a little. I've read a few stories a couple of weeks ago about, Chinese families having to sort of readjust how they live because of higher tariffs on US goods. And similarly, I think the fact that the US is looking at backing down suggests that they are also suffering as a result. So as with anything Donald Trump says, you can't sort of say it with any certainty if this will lead to a better trade deal for both of them, or sort of a cooling of tensions between the two. But I mean, it may show that Trump's statement that trade wars are easy to win may not be so true if both sides are backing down at this late stage.
And I think it's kind of lining up with what a lot of people said. I think that there is an element with Trump of he tries to rock the boat, and he's like, oh, because, and some of this could lead, regardless of your opinions of him, could legitimately be his experience in a business is, people listen to him and do the things he asks, and that's how you act in a business. It's a bit different when it's two countries interacting and there are other things at play. And so then he goes into this with all the bluster and rhetoric as if he was a CEO, and it doesn't quite work that way, and then he wants to have a backroom deal. And I think a lot of these times, maybe he's getting an incremental change, but generally after a period of problematic, but generally after a period where everything is a bit problematic for the US. So, yeah, I think that's the problem with his style of leadership.
Yeah. Trump has many problems, and his style of leadership being more suited to business rather than politics is certainly one of them.
Our next headline from the Times: Help to Buy house giant faces loss of contract.
This is a story that touches on. I want to get this right. They are Persimmon. A giant help to buy creator of houses in the UK. This group was in the news at the end of last year. Do you remember the guy who had a £75 million bonus payout when he was leaving his job?
I mean, I don't remember it specifically. Now I've looked at an article, I see how that links in. But I remember hearing many stories about people getting massive bonuses. So kind of, it didn't jump out as one in particular to me.
He was particularly famous. I'll see if I can try and find the clip somewhere. But there was a BBC interview that was just done on local news, and the reporter asked him about, do you think it's reasonable that you get £75 million? And the director tried to cut the interview off and said, oh, you're going to regret that you said that. And it led to sort of a bigger conversation about, was it right that this man who, that anyone indeed gets £75 million personally for simply walking away from the company. That company is now under the spotlight again as the government looks to conclude its Help to Buy scheme. It started under Cameron's government and is due to end, or at least in its latest iteration, is due to end around about April 2021. And this is one of the big contractors who's under the microscope. That bonus and other investment decisions that they've made particularly put into question whether the government think this is the right house builder to be giving houses for first-time buyers. So I think it's an interesting story, given the state of the current UK housing market. I read another story the other day, or heard one that said under 30s were finally like the majority house buyer in the UK, something that hadn't happened since the mid-90s. So
that's good news.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It shows at least there's a trend there. I don't know how late those people are getting into their 20s before they can buy, or it might be the fact that house prices have at least stabilised, even if they are quite expensive. More people know exactly how much money to put together to buy a house nowadays. But it equally could be worrying for the housing market in general if house prices have started to stagnate so much, particularly with Brexit around the corner. Then who's to say that there won't be a crash just around the corner?
So for our next, not quite a headline, we're going to the BBC for Brexit MPs to have final vote by 12th of March, says May. And this was only posted an hour ago, so this is breaking news as far as the podcast is concerned. I'm sure everyone else will have discussed it by the time this goes out, but it's not in a paper. That's why we're using the BBC here.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on Brexit. This is quite a Brexit-free podcast for once. Yay! But it is, again, that ticking clock to go. I think there's only, when you hear this podcast, there'll only be 3 or 4 Sundays to go until Brexit. So it's getting quite close now. And this is the news that Theresa May said MPs will have the final vote by the 12th of March, which gives them roughly 2 weeks to get that through Parliament and approved before the 29th, when we're due to leave. I saw a tweet relating to this earlier that pointed out that, in fact, since Theresa May allowed MPs to have a meaningful vote, that was around about 57 days ago. And it was about 91 days ago when the original meaningful vote was meant to happen. So I think this shows quite a significant case of the Prime Minister trying to run down the clock and, still present the same deal that she was going to present 91 days ago. But this time it's like, you've only got 2 weeks, guys. You really need to approve this, or it will be no deal. That's what appears to be the case to me anyway.
Yeah, and I've heard other people say things along those lines, and personally I think it's a bit of a risky strategy from what we've seen. And yeah, not particularly happy with this. We're just going to see what happens on the 12th of March, which is... it's going to be after our next episode, so... we'll see. We'll see how things are going. If there's enough craziness to talk about, then we'll talk as normal. And if not, we might delay by 2 days just to get the scoop, as it were. Because that sounds like it's going to be quite important.
Yeah, I think as usual, there's usually some rumblings in Parliament of which way the vote was going to go. I think we knew last time before the big major vote that Theresa May was likely to lose that one. I'll keep my ear to the ground to see if I can find out which way this one's going to go as well.
And our next headline, again from the Times, back public vote or face mass revolt, Corbyn told.
Yes, this is touching on one of the stories that we've talked about quite a bit over the past few weeks, that Jeremy Corbyn appears to be ignoring the call for a public vote or a second vote on the EU referendum. That was a rule that was passed by his own party by about 70% back at the party conference, and it's something that's been left out of all Corbyn's kind of rhetoric ever since then, or at least as he tries to put his deal forward to leave the EU. Now, of course, Jeremy Corbyn isn't in power. There's no way that he could force the Prime Minister to get a second vote. But the fact that it's not even in his rhetoric, the fact that he didn't even mention it in his letter that he sent to Theresa May with, the list of his 5 demands to leave the EU, that's all quite worrying for people who'd invested quite a lot in Corbyn or thought that he'd, stick to his word and deliver that vote in some way, shape or form. The fear here of mass revolt would be from one within the Labour Party, or at least one where he's shown to lose a significant bit of his support from traditional members of that party.
And following on from that, so our next 2 headlines kind of run together and I suppose also tie into this. We have Independent Digital, we will keep May in power, says Tory defector, and City AM with let's get this party started. And that leads us right onto our main story for tonight, doesn't it?
Yes, this is the news, which I'm sure if you've been in the UK, you won't have missed, of the 8 Labour MPs and 3 Conservative MPs that split from their party to form a new group called the Independent.
Who, I think, to be clear at the moment, are not yet a party, they're just a group.
Correct.
But no one's really sure. And they have the website, theindependent.group. A nice TLD there, works very well for them. We're going to cover this in a minute, but their 3 main sections on their website are a statement, who they are, and then support, which is presumably a way... Oh, and donate, so you can give them money. But the big thing you see when you load up their webpage is politics is broken, let's change it.
Yeah, I think that's their big message, and... We talked about this last week, didn't we, about the formation of a possible new centrist party, and this is very much the ideological space that all of that group of 11 MPs fit into now.
We were surprisingly prescient with our discussion by accident. I just want to quickly throw in, before we carry on, that they have a statement of independence on their website, which is not quite a declaration, but it's quite amusingly named.
What does it say? Is it a short statement of independence, or is it sort of like a long list of things?
3 paragraphs and then a section of statements they believe with a tick box for you to say, I agree. I assume if you tick all the boxes to say I agree, it tries to sign you up for a donation or something. I've been on political websites before. They do that kind of thing.
Yeah. That sounds about right. I know that, you mentioned that they're not a political party yet. They certainly don't have any manifesto that they could stand on or, any sort of bullet points that they can point to. I think on that website they say they've got 11 shared values, which is sort of broader than actual policy points. So a value is sort of, I think that, there's too much crime and it should be lower. which is like, oh great, that's a value, but everybody thinks there should be less crime. Not many people think there should be more crime. So you might as well have said nothing. It's a bit like that. Some of the statements I seem to remember reading. So until they do have that manifesto, it's hard to say what they stand for. But how I wanted to start and go into our main story tonight about them was just go through all the MPs that have left and kind of one by one just give a background on the main gripe they had with the party that they were leaving, because I think this is more about the problems that they've got within the two major parties, as it is, it's more about that than the group they want to form. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, until they have, they have some shared values, as you say, but until they have like a clear manifesto for what they're trying to achieve outside of that, I think it's more interesting to focus on who they are and why they have taken this step, and whether whether anyone saw it coming. Really, I think is also an interesting question to look into.
Well, first of all, I can say that I definitely knew that people thought it was coming. I know that it was a bit more than a happy accident that we covered that last week, just because there had been rumblings, particularly after Corbyn's letter, that Chukwuemeka and a set of MPs, both from Labour and the Conservatives, had booked a conference room in Westminster together. Nobody showed up to that meeting, but the mere fact that it was out there and it was public knowledge suggested that
something was going on.
Yeah, correct. And we've had rumblings of a possible split. I think certainly maybe within Labour more than the Conservatives, but both parties have had their gripes over the past few months. But nobody really knew when they were going to do it. Press the go button.
So let's run down the Labour MPs first. Lucina Berger. I have never heard of her.
Yes, so she's one who's been slightly more in the public eye, or was in the weeks running up to this. So she was the MP for Liverpool Wavertree. That's a very strong Remain constituency, and her local party had put her under quite a lot of pressure to have sort of like a no confidence vote in her and unseat her. She's certainly not been a friend of Jeremy Corbyn. She's to the right of the party, and most of the people we're going to be talking about tonight are not ideologically in line with Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, when you think back to the leadership election back in 2015, he could barely scrape together the nominations from within his own party to, be able to get on the ballot in the first place. So when you're talking about core Jeremy Corbynites, it's about Corbyn, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, Emily Thornberry, like a very small handful. So all of these, it's not surprising that they differ from their leader ideologically in some way. Yeah. So the thing about Lucina was that she was also an MP of Jewish heritage and had been receiving quite a lot of anti-Semitic abuse, to the point that she'd had death threats online to her. She had to have an armed guard stationed at her house, and essentially accused Jeremy Corbyn, or there were reports that Jeremy Corbyn knew of death threats to her, but hadn't passed those death threats onto her to let her know that there was some threat, and she had to find out through other members of the Labour Party that had happened. So clearly her personal conviction in Jeremy Corbyn tackling anti-Semitism was shaken, and as a result, that was sort of her main reason that she listed for leaving the Labour Party.
I mean, that seems fair enough to me, especially if your life is under threat. I don't think anyone could argue with those reasons. So next up we have Chris Leslie, who you note is an old Brownite.
Yes, I was listening to another podcast that described him. He got elected in. Let me just check. I've got the link there to all that. There's a very good BBC article that tells you the list of all the MPs and when they were elected and when not. So so Chris Leslie was elected in 1997 in the landslide election for Tony Blair. He was apparently one of the jokes was that Tony Blair looked at this bloke who'd won an unexpected seat in Shipley, and he said, "Gosh, that looks a lot like the guy who does the photocopying for Gordon Brown." And somebody had to go, "Tony is the guy who does the photocopying for Gordon Brown." So he's been in the party a long time, but on the fringes, and he was re-elected again in 2005. So he's very much ideologically against Corbyn, more in the Brownite camp, and his main reason was the one that we talked about with the people's vote. So one of his big quotes from the speeches that they all gave, I don't know if I mentioned this up top, but as part of the press conferences, one by one, the MPs who'd left the Labour Party came forward and gave their reason for leaving the party. And in his speech, he said that the betrayal on Europe was visible for all to see. So, i.e., no people's vote means that I can't stay in the party.
So next up we have Angela Smith, who I'm afraid I also haven't heard of.
You're not going to have heard from a lot of these people. They're all quite like Labour backbenchers, apart from the one I've kind of like left towards the end. But Angela Smith, she was another MP who was sort of facing a vote of no confidence from her own party members. And she herself said that this had been responsible for the hard left of the party that had forced her to go into this vote. So that's somebody who's quite clearly at odds with the ideological shift that's happening with the party and the move to the left.
Yeah, and next up we have Gavin Shuker, who I think I've heard the name of briefly, but looking at his picture I don't recognise him.
Yeah, he's very much like as above. Vote of no confidence from some of the members in his party was threatened. And he also blamed the climate of anti-Semitism, or at least the lack of action on that point, for one of his reasons for leaving the party.
And then we have Mike Gapes, who I don't recognise either.
Yep. He's slightly different. He mentioned foreign policy concerns. So again, he mentioned Russia, Venezuela, and Syria by name. Those are all areas where the Blairites or the Brownites within the party would have taken a very different view to Corbyn. So Corbyn has been less likely to convict Russia of, the Novichok scandal. Corbyn was one of the most cautious, saying like, hey, wait up till we've got all the facts here. Let's not blame Russia, when a lot of people could see from the evidence, or at least assume from the evidence that was put before them, that it was very, very likely Russia. Corbyn sort of wanted that cast iron guarantee before he said anything, and that made some within his party feel uncomfortable with how close he may be to Russia. On Venezuela, that's a country that's going through an awful lot of turmoil at the moment. I know yesterday there were clashes on the border as aid was trying to get in from Colombia, and as the opposition tries to oust the current socialist regime. Venezuela had previously sort of been touted as a socialist success story before its collapse, and now it's being touted by right-wing press as an example that true socialism doesn't work. So there's ideological clashes around that. And on Syria, you may remember that Jeremy Corbyn was at odds with most of his party when David Cameron had a vote to have airstrikes within Syria. Jeremy Corbyn gave one speech saying, no, we shouldn't. Meanwhile, his own foreign secretary at the time, Tony Benn, gave quite an impassioned speech to say, this is why we need to strike, and this is why we need to stand up to ISIS. So his is a slightly more niche concern, but it is something that may concern somebody who's looking, if Jeremy Corbyn is to be a future Prime Minister and these are going to be his foreign policy objectives, then if he's at odds with that, then he felt he could no longer stay within the party, knowing that he was so opposed to the foreign policy agenda.
So next up we have Chuka Umunna, who is definitely, you've noticed he's most high profile. He insert gif of I will watch your career with great interest. But yeah, he was mentioned a long time ago, pre the votes that brought Corbyn to power, as a potential future Labour leader. And I think when I looked into him at the time, he looked good to me as an option. And then he was in the election race against Corbyn, which he didn't win because Corbyn won. So he's definitely, I would imagine, maybe not a household name, but if you've been paying attention to politics at all in the last few years, you must have heard him come up. And he's been involved in campaigning for Remain, and ever since Brexit has actually been underway, I think he's definitely been one they've gone to for sound bites on the BBC. He's definitely been there as a kind of a opposing voice within the Labour Party.
Yeah, he was going to stand in 2015 against Corbyn and was one of the front runners, and then withdrew his own campaign after a couple of weeks, saying that he didn't like the scrutiny his life was under, or something. Whatever it was, the time wasn't right. So nobody ever got to vote on him. but everybody had still sort of earmarked him as a possible future Labour leader. After Corbyn now, or at least the way that the party is structured and the way that it would favour a more Corbynite candidate in the future, that's probably unlikely to happen. So Chuka may have seen his potential future go up in flames. So what he's devoted most of his time to after the referendum campaign is being the voice of Remain in a lot of quarters. He was one of the principal MPs involved in the People's Vote campaign. And he was the one who a lot of people said if there's going to be a split within the party, he's the one who will lead it. It's worth pointing out that this independent group of MPs doesn't have a leader at this point in time. They're all equals, just all independent MPs. They're not a party in that sense. They keep sort of stressing that. But if you were going to call a de facto leader, then Chuka would be the one.
He's definitely been doing. He's just been a bit more. He's just generally a bit more outspoken and interviewable, partly because of all that history we've mentioned. So it's not surprising that it kind of defaults to him.
Yeah, and again, unsurprisingly, the big issue that led to him resigning is probably Brexit and how the Labour Party has been handling Brexit, particularly the promise for a second referendum or a vote on that. That hasn't come across, and Chuka feels that that's the time to leave the party if they're not going to pursue a people's vote.
And then we have Anne Coffey, who I think I recognise, having looked at the pictures in that article, but I couldn't tell you where from.
Yeah. So I've pointed her out, and like you say, she's probably, I hadn't heard of her before this. She's not a particularly memorable MP, or doesn't have the profile of Chuka Umunna, but she's significant in another way, that she's been an MP since 1992. So all the others I've spoken about are class of 97 to 2005 intake. They're all MPs who ideologically were voted in at a time where Blairism was king. Back in 1992, they had Neil Kinnock as a leader, and they were slightly more to the left. And having an MP like Anne Coffey join in on this group, and I actually read her statement, and she doesn't bash the party a lot. She doesn't talk about Brexit or anti-Semitism particularly. She just says that the party is not one that she recognises, that she joined in 1992. And she said it was very sad because she thought she would die, being in the Labour Party, and things have changed so much where she feels now is the time to leave. She's the one MP you could sort of look at and say, if more were to follow, if this was a group that was going to take a large group of MPs, they could point to Anne Coffey's actions and say, well, this is why I'm leaving, or like it's not just disaffected Blairites that are leaving. There are sort of like true Labour through and through people, or old Labour within this group as well, that feel uncomfortable with the current direction the party's going in.
And then we've got two more who we're only going to briefly touch on. There's Joan Ryan, who left again on anti-Semitism, which we're going to discuss in a minute. And then Ian Austin, who hasn't joined the independent group. What happened with him?
He's slightly odd, I think. I mean, he's been under sort of like threats of a no confidence vote from his own party for a while as well. He's been a very vocal critic of Corbyn personally. But I think, let me just get this right, I believe that he was in quite a strong Leave constituency. So he hasn't been, the result in his constituency was 67.6% Leave. So he can't really leave under the Brexit banner. He only won by 22 votes in the last election, which probably means that any hope of him being elected back again by a personal mandate is almost zero. So this, to me, the last MP to leave, Ian Austin, it appears to be the kind of like the last hurrah of, well, I know I'm not going to get elected again. Let's leave the Labour Party because now's as good a time as any to do it.
Kind of tagging on there. So we've gone through there, and there were some people had the same reasons as each other. Do we want to go through those different claims and see what our thoughts are on those? So, the big one we have discussed before is anti-Semitism within the Labour Party.
So, I wanted to touch on this briefly because, of course, it's a very thorny and complicated issue, and many Labour supporters would say that the Labour Party has done quite a bit to try and target anti-Semitism in the short term. You've had the Chakrabarti inquiry that's been, trying to look at cases of anti-Semitism and dismiss people where appropriate. There were also reports just before this came out that Labour was investigating over 600 reports of anti-Semitism and were looking to take action on each one. So I think the party is clear that there is a crisis within there, and they are going to, they are looking to resolve it. However, it's still quite a thorny issue, and the way that Jeremy Corbyn deals with it, or is seen to deal with it, is a matter of debate. I have many pro-Corbynites there saying that, Jeremy Corbyn's doing all he can and saying that, anti-Semitism is just a smear against the Labour Party. It's a stick to beat Corbyn with. I personally think that Jeremy Corbyn is not anti-Semitic at all. He is trying to fight it. However, the media has been so hostile to him within the United Kingdom that when people, bring up anti-Semitism as a legitimate concern, his response to that is a little bit feisty and a little bit sort of like a bunker mentality of, we're doing everything, why don't you? There was not a particularly good interview he did with Sky News in the aftermath of these MPs leading, where he sort of lost his temper a little. With the person who's interviewing, saying, why aren't you talking to these Jewish people who support what I've done? And the reporter was sort of saying, but Jeremy, there's a lot of genuine concerns from other Jewish people who feel you aren't doing enough. Like, how can you address these? Again, it's a really complicated issue, but as Tom Watson said this morning in an interview on the Marr Show, he said that Jeremy Corbyn has to lead from the front here and take more of a personal responsibility for what's going on in the party in this matter. What happened to Lucinda Berger and the party's leadership office not passing on death threats to her? It's not anti-Semitic that they did that, but it's certainly not good leadership to do that, to look after your own MP within your party. So that's my opinion. I don't know if you've got anything to add on that topic.
Yeah, I think there is, as you say, in the media there's been this press on Corbyn, and Corbyn himself isn't anti-Semitic, in my opinion, but you need to be seen to do more is probably more of it. I don't doubt that there's stuff going on, but if people are having to leave over it, anti-Semitism is obviously a thing that needs to be stopped. But yeah, I think as the problem we have here is he's the leader. And so, yeah, he might be like, it's kind of almost coming down to technicalities where he's like, well, I'm not anti-Semitic. It's like, yes, Jeremy, but people have tarred you with this brush now. So you now need to almost go out of your way to make it obvious that you're not. And I think that's where the problem lies. So I'm sure they are doing stuff in the party that, not being an internal member of the party is harder for us to see. But it's obviously not enough for these leaving MPs. And it's also not enough for the optics to the media. And if it's such an easy knife for the various right-wing papers to turn, they should really just come up with a better way of handling that so that it's obvious on the outside that they are dealing with it. So on to a lighter news. Brexit and how the Labour Party has handled Brexit. Or, well, I suppose also how Corbyn has handled Brexit, because that's who they're choosing. That's most of their claims that it's to do with the leadership of the party, right?
So, in short, and I'll talk about this in generalities here, but there has been a worry from lots of MPs within the Labour Party that Jeremy Corbyn may not be as, pro-Remain as he first appeared. There were accusations, and that's what led to the second leadership challenge right after the result of the referendum, was that Jeremy Corbyn hadn't really campaigned enough during the Remain campaign to sort of say, this is why we want to stay in the EU. And that feeling's sort of hung around ever since. Now, the Labour Party's official position is that it supports Brexit. That was in its manifesto in 2017. And Jeremy Corbyn can point to the largest vote that Labour's had, even I think in terms of percentage and number of votes, it was bigger than Tony Blair's in 1997. So he can say that he's got a large amount of people that support his policy on Brexit. However, I think the reality is slightly different, that when I was talking to a lot of my friends and people at the 2017 election, they all said, oh, well, Labour's position on Brexit is that they support it, but don't worry, it's a super soft Brexit and he doesn't really mean it, and he's Remain really, and he'll come up with a way to get out of it. There was a very...
And I think that lines up with my impression of how people felt about it as well.
Now, of course, as we mentioned, the deadline is very, very soon. Jeremy Corbyn's had to come out and be more firm on what his proposals are if we were to leave the EU, particularly if there's going to be any sort of cross-party vote that would pass in the Commons. Jeremy Corbyn needs to be involved in that. Corbyn so far has listed his 5 plans, and as I mentioned in that letter, there was no mention of a people's vote or hope of a second referendum. This second referendum was voted on by a large majority of the party membership at the Labour Party conference back in 2018. Jeremy Corbyn has always promoted himself to be a great believer in democratising the party and listening to the party when it wants its view heard, and this is probably the one issue where you can point out and say, actually, he doesn't seem to be listening to their views. That's what's upset a lot of MPs and a lot of members, and that's what has driven, I think that's what's made this split possible. 1 or 2 MPs could quit because of anti-Semitism in the party, particularly if it was directed towards them themselves. But I believe that Brexit is the big driving factor that has allowed such a big group to split off and for them to have a hope of support within the wider public. We've mentioned how at the last general election, the Conservatives and Labour combined had over 80% of the vote. We know that 80% of the country doesn't support Brexit. That's not a fair comparison to say. So the fact that you've got these Remainers looking for a political home, that's somewhere for them to go, and that's why the party's split down those lines. I don't know if you've got anything more to add on that.
Not really. I mean, I did have some concerns about Corbyn's view on Brexit because it was unclear during the general election run-up and all of that. But I also felt like, in general, Labour was for Remain as a party. So it didn't concern me too much. And I think his 5 things he wants for Brexit, that kind of lined up with my opinion at the moment, which is like, Brexit is kind of happening and we've let the cat out of the bag. We've opened Pandora's box and it's going to happen, unfortunately. I would, like I've said before, if I could click my fingers and make Brexit go away, I would. But I feel like we're kind of, we've touched on it before, having another referendum probably isn't going to help us at this stage. It would. I don't know how. I have no. I mean, there are 2 options for a referendum, right? And just a revote, which would be terrible because it kind of shows that referendums are pointless. I mean, the only upside of that would be if we then stopped having referendums. But I think there are some things that I would legitimately say having a referendum for is useful. And the other kind of referendum you can have is one on the final deal, which I just don't think is going to help, because if it's yes or no on the deal, well, that's like yes, the deal, or no, no deal, which is just as bad, and essentially the thing that's already going to the MPs. And the alternative is you have like various levels of things to vote for in that referendum. You'd have to have the EU to have agreed to all of them up front, which seems unlikely. And then it's like, yeah, there's nowhere to go. We haven't got the time to kind of keep voting on possible deals in referendums nationwide. They're not easy things to organise. So I think that's the problem with going back to a people's vote. So I can understand why he's not doing a people's vote, but I can also understand why people are annoyed if they've had a referendum within the party on it and everyone's been like, we should have one. So I can understand that, but it's kind of with a lot of Brexit things, between a rock and a hard place. I don't know what would happen. I suppose he could just say he's for a people's vote, knowing it won't actually happen if he says it. Maybe that would have been a better move from a PR point of view. He keeps saying, "Oh, I want one," but the Tories won't give me one. Might have been better for his PR. But I think his current actions have generally been in line with what I think was going to happen. I feel he could have been a bit more attacky in Parliament. I have individual criticisms of him, but I think overall the Labour Party's stance is kind of like, this is happening and it's kind of bad, but we have to deal with it, which is kind of my view of the whole thing.
Yeah, he's been more pragmatic than I think he'd be, and it would have been easy for him just to say, yeah, we'll do this vote, and not do it at all. But yeah, that certainly leads to a lot of the party members feeling alienated from their leader, even if his hands are tied and he can only really sort of has very limited options when it comes to Brexit and how he can influence the final outcome.
And finally, we touched on briefly foreign policy within the Labour Party, and we mentioned socialist states and things like that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I covered most of it when I was talking about their concerns and the difference between sort of the Blairite policy that was far more interventionist and Corbyn's, which is very much, we should never get, there's a very, very high barrier to engaging in combat when it comes to Corbyn's leadership. I think that this is a much more inside baseball question and is more sort of one MP with a gripe against Jeremy Corbyn rather than the whole party. However, it shouldn't be ignored entirely. It is something that will have to be considered at the next general election in particular. I think last time in 2017, people were maybe less concerned about any foreign policy goals because I'm being honest here, I don't think anybody expected Jeremy Corbyn to win the last general election. The result he got was probably the best one he could have got on the night, which was stopping a Tory majority. All the predictions, all the polls said that on a bad night, it's going to be a landslide. On a good night, then Labour might get enough to stop a Tory majority, and that's what happened. Now, in another election, it could be far more likely for Corbyn to become PM, so they may scrutinise those foreign policy aspects a little bit more. So that might be something for the future, but I don't think that's the reason the party split. Again, Jeremy Corbyn was always very, he was in the Labour Party when they went to war in Iraq. He had a very different policy to his leader, but he stayed within it. I don't think that itself would have caused a split without Brexit happening at the same time.
For that MP, it was very much kind of, that's his niche concern in this situation. So we're going to move on from there. And so the timeline here was, I believe it was Tuesday we heard about the 7 MPs leaving?
Yes.
The first 7. So we had those Labour MPs leaving. And I saw a fair amount of back and forth from various friends of mine. A lot of my friends who are Labour supporters were unimpressed because I think there has been this general concern that there's going to be a split with either of the two major parties. And I think with Labour going first, as it were, people were concerned that Labour might come crashing down. And obviously there's annoyance if people have been voted in as a Labour Party member and now they're not supporting Labour. We've seen that when MPs have switched before, although MPs switching allegiance is nothing new. And also, I think there was, general, a feeling of why is this happening now? And we know what the reasons are. It's pre-Brexit and people want to tie their colours to the mast and things like that to try and get into a better position post-Brexit. I think that's fairly clear to most people that will be part of the calculation. But yeah, it definitely felt, judging by the Facebook post I saw, to the average Labour supporter, it was a bit of a kick in the teeth to suddenly be like, oh, Labour are going to collapse. So then, in some ways, I think it was a relief to them when the 3 Conservatives who left later in the week, and they've also joined the independent group. So I think we're just going to run through those 3 again in the same way as we just did.
Yeah, it might be better to group them together slightly because they all resigned at the same time and they all had the same letter to Theresa May where they all sort of jointly outlined their reasons for leaving.
But I mean, we still want to describe who they are as we work through.
Yeah, of course. So we've got Anna Sewsbury.
And she is, if people don't recognise her name, it is similar to Chucker earlier. She has been very vocal about several things recently, and I would say she's one of those, as backbench MPs go, if you haven't heard of her, it's a bit surprising.
She's been very vocal. You've probably seen her on the news getting accosted by the yellow-jacketed protesters around her. There was a big furore about her protection around there because she's one of the sort of arch-remainers within the Conservative Party, has been a very vocal critic of Theresa May, both sort of privately and very, very publicly. She was an MP. Let me just get her...
Oh, do you want the little summary from the BBC?
I'm just trying to get her summary from the BBC about her constituency and how much she won.
She won by 863 votes, and her constituency was 53% Leave.
So yeah, she won there. I remember that on the night, I think she was one of the few Conservative MPs within the sort of like London and Greater London area to keep her seat, because in 2017 there was a huge sort of like swing towards Labour in those areas, and she directly attacked the policies of Theresa May and her sort of like move to the right as a reason why the election had been so close, and was really damning even on election night of how Theresa May had done. So it's no secret that she dislikes the leader, and she's definitely doubled down here. One of the big things she said in one of her interviews was that the party had become blue kip, which is a mixture of the Conservatives and UKIP, and she also sort of like publicly criticised May while she had been Home Secretary for her policies on immigration. So I think it's fair to say that she's not the best friend to Theresa May, has a bit of personal beef there as well, but mostly you'd say her biggest ideological reason would have been Brexit and that big split between them.
And I think on the day, there was an interview with her on the day, and she didn't hold back. She clearly, I don't know if we're going to touch on this later for the others, but she clearly was happy to be in a position where she could openly criticise things she may have held back on previously. And considering how much she was criticising when she was a member of the Conservative Party, it was fun to watch. I'll see if I can find that video and put it in the show notes.
Yeah, it's definitely anything that she said was very entertaining to watch. She doesn't hold back. So next we've got Heidi Allen, who was previously working with the Work and Pensions Secretary and has been quite a vocal critic, whilst part of the Conservative Party, of the universal tax credits and how they're applied. She's been an MP in the past who's had to sort of stand up in the Houses of Parliament and say to other Conservatives, why am I the only nice one here? Almost along that extent, to say, yeah, we should be doing, having like a far more liberal or one nation Conservative approach to benefits and benefit reform. She's also a member of quite a heavy Remain constituency with 62% Remain, 38% Leave. So again, she's another MP who not only left because of Brexit, but I think with her it's genuinely that she is one of the Conservatives that's further to the left of her party and far more central. And again, she worried that the Conservatives were already going too far right for her, not just in Brexit policy, but also on social concerns as well. So here was an opportunity to leave, and she took it, essentially.
I think I've seen Heidi Allen in passing, but she's not as well known to me as the others. So finally we have Sarah Wollaston, and I think I've heard her name, but I couldn't have put a name to a face.
Yeah, again, she's the MP for Totnes, so she's down in Cornwall, where traditionally the battles are not Conservative Labour, but more Conservative Liberal Democrat, or at least that's how they've been down there. And she's from a marginally Remain constituency. Again, I think her concerns were more based towards the Brexit end, and she's certainly the Conservative MP with the sort of like least big profile on this issue, but she still had some significant concerns about the way that the country was going. The line I've pulled out for her from the letter that was sent by all three of them, they've said that the result of the referendum was 52 to 48. She feels that the Conservative government has sidelined the views of 48% of the British public. And that was one of the big reasons for her leaving the party and joining the independent group.
Some people were angry about their MPs or MPs in the parties they supported choosing to leave and form this group. And you've thrown in a YouGov link. It's quite interesting seeing where... This is similar to the chart that we used in the How Many Things episode about the general election. And I think we've discussed on maybe an early episode of this podcast, where on the left you have the current Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem and other voting intention. And then when they add in the independent group as an option, you see where people come from. And it's quite interesting that the most are from the Lib Dems, which I find surprising, and it reduces the Lib Dem majority. Majority is the wrong term. It reduces the percentage of votes for the Lib Dems quite considerably. It looks almost like this might not be half. Oh, some of them have gone down to don't know. But yeah, there's a small amount of Conservatives coming down, a decent chunk of Labour, and then some people who are already in other going, oh yeah, the independent group sounds right for me. So that puts them to 14% of the overall electorate based on this poll, which is interesting. That makes them bigger than the Lib Dems based on this poll.
Yes. It's a bit of a kick in the teeth for the Lib Dems, who've existed for far longer, to have a party just come along for a day and already outpoll them. But I think it shows what we mentioned in the last episode, that a lot of people would vote for Lib Dem policies, but without the sort of taint of being in a coalition with the Conservatives and Labour. This thing that's sort of coming out fresh-faced allows more people to say, oh, this is something different, I might vote for them, or I might vote for a party that had that going for it. That might be why, in fact, so many Lib Dems associate with it. They'd say, oh yes, I'd vote for a party that had those policies, because they're pretty much the same as what the Lib Dems stand for, at least in their Brexit viewpoint. I think you mentioned earlier that as well, that a lot of friends said that they were worried that it was reducing Labour's chance of winning. It was undermining, if parties split, then that means that they're not a viable winner at the next general election. And the worry was that as Labour split first, that's like, those Labour MPs have single-handedly undone our chances of winning the next election. The fact that Conservatives decided to split as well shows that there's trouble with both parties, that both of them have to consider what's going on. Even though the Conservatives, I think, arguably have been far less affected, both in the number of MPs that they've lost and in the number of voters that are swayed by this independent group that's appeared. It still shows that at least some Conservatives are willing to go over to a more centrist party and place their faith in that instead.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting, as we were talking about polarisation in politics, that there is a group trying to go for this middle way, which is, as we said, a bit more New Labour in feel, at least from the majority of them. So one point that did get mentioned, I know quite a few people were saying that if they leave their party, I mentioned this earlier, well then, people voted for them because they were the Labour Party candidate. In fact, amusingly, one of them mentioned, I can't remember who it was, she came up on stage and said, hello, I'm the Labour MP for blah, before catching herself. So, it's very ingrained that party is part of who you are within politics. So the question is, should they hold by-elections? Are they now, is the mandate from their constituents them, or is it them and the party, and therefore is the party a big enough part of it that they should immediately go to a by-election because they have left the party?
So this is a big debate that has puzzled, politicians for years. A lot of MPs would like to think that without them, the party wouldn't succeed, that they have a huge personal vote. However, as traditionally is the case when MPs leave a party, so Zach Goldsmith left the Conservatives in protest over the Heathrow expansion, and he said that he would step down as an MP, he would step down as a member of the Conservative Party and have a by-election in his constituency if the Conservatives decided to erect a runway there. He did so, and as a result, he lost to the Lib Dem candidate who went against him. And the Conservatives, although they ran a candidate, sort of split the vote between them and Zach Goldsmith, and that was enough for the Lib Dems to win. Mark Reckless was a Conservative MP who switched to UKIP just before the 2015 election. He ended up using his constituency, and the Conservatives won. So it's one of those things where personal mandate really means very little. I think the only MP who may survive in a by-election would be Chuka, who's got a majority of, let me just check, what's his majority? I think it was 26,000. It was very, very big. 2 seconds.
Yeah, 26,000 MP for Streatham. And his constituency is 79% remain, so it's not surprising.
Yeah, so he may be able to, although a lot of those people might say that your majority increased so much last election because you were a member of the Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party. That's why it was so much bigger than it was back in 2010 when he first got elected. So I think that in the majority of cases, those independent MPs would lose if a by-election should happen. And I think the majority of people vote for a party rather than the person involved. However, in this instance, there's no legal thing that says they must have a by-election. By-elections are only mandated if an MP is arrested or is forcibly removed by. I think constituents can decide to vote out an MP, but that's never happened. The sort of like whole, the hoops you've got to jump through to do that, such an obstruction that it's never happened before. This is an opportunity for these MPs to try and form a new political group and get some political capital before they're voted out altogether. I feel that if you just had a by-election immediately, any hopes of this sort of like new party would be snuffed out completely, and that's a bit unfair that those people wouldn't be allowed a voice or wouldn't be allowed to have an influence on something before they had before they were just removed automatically. Otherwise, you get very entrenched in this two-party system. I think people within those constituencies who voted for the Labour Party and now have got somebody who maybe doesn't represent their interests have a right to be aggrieved. But I think maybe my retort to this, or what I've been thinking of, is if these MPs are voting on an issue of Brexit, if they are campaigning for a people's vote, then the members of those constituencies, they get a chance to vote out that MP in 2022. I may never have a chance to vote on membership of the European Union again in my lifetime, which is more democratic. I would rather somebody sort of sacrifice their personal position to try and get me that opportunity rather than them have a by-election and that never happened. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think I see what you're saying, and I think if you look at the people get angry. I think some of the anger was due to feeling betrayed by members of a party people are a member of, and I mean, I don't think any of my friends were constituents in these constituencies. So it was when I've seen these discussions, it's been in general terms there's something they feel they don't like about it. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it. I think what you're saying is quite reasonable. And also, if you look, I mean, but we want progress in general. But if you look at the precedent, people have moved across the aisle, as it were, in the past and kept their position and not had to have a by-election. And I don't think there was as much talk about it, as far as I can see. I mean, obviously, it's very, we see a lot of news nowadays, and I'd have to have a look back and see. But I mean, Churchill famously moved around to see. Churchill famously moved around to see when he lost his position within the Conservative Party, and then eventually came back to the Conservatives. But that is a thing that happened. I don't think I disagree with you on that. I think they've been voted in, and yes, it was because of which party they were, but also they were voted in. People had to like them and believe in their policies, not just necessarily Labour policies or Tory policies. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the reason there's such sort of a visceral reaction against it is, I've mentioned it before, but whoever splits, there's a fear that, if you split, then you're just helping the other guy out. You're helping the Conservatives out. I've heard from those sort of like deeply entrenched in Labour saying that any vote that's not for Labour is a vote for the Conservative Party. That's including if you vote Green, SNP, Independent, anything. They say no. That all that does is help the Tories. The only option to get rid of the Tories is a Labour government. And in some way they're right. It's a two-party system. It's one that favours that. But at the same time, a lot of people feel politically homeless. A lot of people feel they want another option, and that neither of the two parties represent their views. So it's a really tough choice for those people just to say, sorry, you've got to vote tactically your whole lives. You want to try and, you want to give another party a voice and not get so angry that some people in your own group are splitting. The MPs that left didn't do it for a laugh. They didn't do it, just making light of the situation. Many of them saw that. I heard some commentators, I think it was in particular Laura Koonsberg of the BBC, tweeted on that day saying that you can see that this is a really hard decision for all these Labour MPs who are leaving. They know the hate they're going to get. They know the problems they're going to be, getting, the concerns amongst, that this is the thing that allows the Conservative Party to win the next general election because of them. But it's something they felt they had to do and that they had very strong convictions for leaving. I don't think any MP would go back on that decision now.
So I suppose the final thing we mentioned, this is a group and not a party. And that's an interesting distinction because within the world of politics, parties can raise money in certain ways and they also get an amount of money. If they're above a certain size, they get an amount of money from, for electioneering, etc. So what does it mean that they're not yet a party? And do we think they're going to stay a group for very long if there is a way for them to, get more funding and so on by being a party?
I don't think they will become a party until they know that there's a general election on the horizon. However, it means that, for them being funded, I don't think they've got any shortage of people wanting to fund them, for the very simple reason that, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party economically wants to, tax the richest and, in order to help the poor. But by taxing the richest, and that might upset the economy, there's a lot of people who've got things invested in the status quo that may want to invest in a new centrist party and have been looking for a place to put that money. Equally, the Conservative Party seem to support a no-deal Brexit, which would also upset the whole structure of the British economy and would make a lot of people lose a lot of money. So this seems to be almost the party of the status quo or of stability or of the one, just to continue the politics of, the last 10 years, or not quite, but at least keep the economic stability that they've got. So that's why I don't think they'll have any trouble getting the funding and staying a group like that, where they don't have to divulge who their funding comes from at the moment. What I will say is that Chuka Umunna has had an interview with Channel 4 where he said, no, once we've got... They might also at this stage be waiting to see how many more people get involved in this group. Once they've got a good idea, once it settles, there may be more defections from either party after March 29th, depending on how Brexit goes. I think that would be the moment for them to actually form a party and say this is what we stand for and have a publicly available list of donors. At the moment, for the next month, they can survive on private donations and sort of put forward the idea of a new centrist party in British politics would be a good idea. However, after Brexit happens, that's the time for the iron to sort of strike while it's hot and see if they can be an actual viable force in British politics.
Just kind of as a way to round out this discussion, I think we're finished with what we want to say today before moving on to the quick polls update. There's a good article in The Guardian from David Mitchell about binary politics, and it's interesting. It's talking about how the parties only care about the parties continuing to exist. So, for example, there's now a new document that Labour MPs have to sign that essentially says, I will believe in Labour regardless of the leadership, essentially. And I think that's an interesting thing that's changing. Like we've mentioned before, the Conservatives are very good at making the party survive at the expense of members or even the country. But it's also true that Labour are doing things like that. So that the idea that the party is more important than anything else. And so the idea that Labour or Conservatives can swing one way ideologically, but still be considered that party is quite interesting. And basically, I'd just say read the article. It's very good.
It looks. Reading it now, I will listen to anything David Mitchell has to say. He's a wonderful human being, and that it raises a good philosophical question. I think. Do you continue to be part of something even if it is only the same in name only to what you had first signed up for? It's almost the perfect counterpoint to the by-election thing. You voted for an MP and they've moved party, but have they actually moved party, or were there were their ideals, were they ideologically fixed, and you knew you were voting for that person with those ideals at the time, and it's the party that's moved rather than the person.
And so we'll move into a quick polls update. Wow, so when we last spoke, it would have been about the 10th of February, and we'd seen 2 strong Conservative polls. But since then, it's been Conservative, 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 and 2 ties. So that's pretty damning for Labour, right? And if you look, Labour have started to drop. The Conservatives had a bit of a move up, but there's also a move up to UKIP. Oh, sorry, a move up to the Lib Dems, not UKIP. And a slight move up for the Greens. The UKIP's starting to die down again, probably because they're thinking the Conservatives are going to be more Brexity, as we've discussed before. Still, none of them at the heights they were at in mid-2017. But it's just Labour has taken a bit of a nosedive since the 1st of February.
Yes, and you can... So if the Labour nosedive started at the start of February, then people may point to that's Jeremy Corbyn's fault. That's why that's happened, because of his Brexit policy. However, the more they go down and the quicker they go down, more people will start to say, well, that's the independent group's fault, and point to them instead. I linked to 2 polls that were taken by Sky Data on the 19th of Feb, I think the day after the IG group was formed. They had the independent group polling at 10%, Labour on 26%, and the Conservatives at 32%. So that's showing the Conservatives as significantly lower than the sort of 40-odd that they've been polling in some of the bigger polls. But Labour at 26% looks pretty damning or pretty low.
And the independent group having gone above the Lib Dems almost immediately.
Yes, again is damning for the Lib Dems. I know the Lib Dems have already said that they may not stand MPs against those who are, they won't put a Lib Dem candidate in an area where an independent group MP is standing, which sort of shows that they are ideologically tied to them in some way. The other interesting link that came out of that was that how people had voted in the past, people who said they'd vote for the independent group in another election, how had they voted before? So they'd mentioned how people who said they'd voted for the independent group, how did they vote in 2017? 37% had voted Labour, 27% had voted Conservatives, and 24% said they didn't vote last time. So that sort of suggests that the independent group is taking more away from Labour supporters than Conservative, but again, it is a mix. And looking for those third groups and which party they are affecting the most will probably be the focus of our polling in the near future. I expect personally that the excitement around the IG group will die down. Yes, yeah, certainly. As they come under more scrutiny, and people have said, oh, you haven't got a manifesto, and have realised that, in a lot of cases, I couldn't vote for an independent group MP. I assume you couldn't either. In fact, there's only 11 constituencies across the whole of the UK where it actually matters, and they're not that electorally significant yet. But wait until after Brexit, as we've said, and see if they become a larger political force. That will be the really interesting thing.
As I said earlier, we'll watch their careers with great interest. It's interesting to see where this goes. We didn't talk about the possibility of a third party last time, another central party last time, because, for our health, it's a thing that's interesting, and maybe this is, at least with our system, maybe this is the inevitable backlash against polarisation, because we don't, while we have a functionally two-party system, there is wriggle room within that system to maybe break it if enough people go behind an independent group or something like this. So, interesting things to watch in the future, and we'll keep our eyes on the polls as we do every 2 weeks. Thank you as always for joining me, Rob, and giving me all your insight into the political landscape. For our listeners, obviously you can come and join us on Discord and listen to us as we record if you'd like. Always nice to have people correcting us in the chat. You can come and find the latest episode show notes at parliamentary.observer/211. Or you can just come and comment on the episode, or whatever you want to do. That's where our home on the internet is. And you can go to Facebook and find us as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at UnParlPodcast. And you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And I don't put these kind of things in the end every time, but any reviews you can leave on whatever service you use to watch podcasts would be greatly appreciated, as basically 5-star reviews are what affect algorithms and get us found and help grow listenership. So yeah, if you have the opportunity to go and drop a review, whether that's on Apple Podcasts or somewhere else, please do that. As always, Rob, I'll see you in 2 weeks, and thank you for joining me. I think it's good night from me.
It's a good night from him. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Did I pronounce Huawei right? Who knows?
I believe you did. I believe you did.